like, if somebody come up and say, David Allan Coe, listen, my favorite song is Jody Like Melody. I'll talk to that motherfucker all night long. What I don't like is the people that come up, they said you're somebody, who are you? What do you sing? What do you do?
Yeah.
Get the fuck away from me.
David Allan Coe lived a life that could only be described as a storm, loud, unpredictable, and filled with destruction as much as brilliance. He was a man who stood out even among the outlaws of country music, a figure who pushed boundaries further than anyone dared. While legends like Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson were celebrated as rebels, Coe embodied rebellion itself, wearing his pain like a badge of honor. From his earliest days, he carried scars that shaped every song he sang and every choice he made. His journey took him from prison cells to stages packed with fans, from moments of musical genius to nights of despair fueled by drugs, loneliness, and bad decisions. Yet behind the rhinestones, tattoos, and bravado was a man aching for acceptance, haunted by demons that never let him go. And when the music faded, when the outlaw life became too heavy to carry, his ending was not filled with glory or peace, but with heartbreak, loss, and the shadows of a life lived too hard for too long. This is the sad life and ending of David Allan Coe. David Allan Coe's life of chaos and rebellion didn't begin on a stage under bright lights. It began in darkness, in the streets of Akron, Ohio, where poverty and neglect were constants. Born in 1939, Coe's childhood was one of pain, instability, and struggle. His family life offered little comfort, and instead of finding warmth at home, he often found discipline, rejection, and violence. From an early age, he was branded as a troublemaker, a boy who couldn't fit into the mold that society demanded. By the time he was a teenager, Coe had already been sent through a carousel of reform schools, each one supposedly designed to straighten him out, but instead only hardening his anger toward authority. He was shuffled from one institution to another, each stay longer and harsher than the last, and each time he came out more bitter and more determined to live life on his own terms. Crime became his survival. Petty thefts, fights, and run-ins with the law filled his youth, and eventually, those petty acts turned into serious offenses that landed him behind bars. The walls of prison became as familiar to him as any stage he would one day stand on, and it was there, locked away, that the seeds of his music began to take root. In prison, Coe learned to channel his anger and experiences into songs. His lyrics came straight from his reality, harsh tales of violence, desperation, and a world that chewed him up and spit him out. These weren't polished Nashville ballads or radio-friendly tunes. They were raw confessions, born in a place where survival often meant fighting another day. The abuse he faced in reform schools, the loneliness of being locked up, and the rejection he felt from society fueled a creative fire that would one day make him an outlaw legend. But as a young man, that fire was destructive, leading him deeper into cycles of punishment and rebellion. He spent much of his early life trapped in the system, serving time in some of the toughest prisons in Ohio. And it was there he began to develop the hardened persona that would follow him for the rest of his life. David Allan Coe's childhood wasn't just troubled. It was the foundation of everything that came after. His crimes and punishments weren't random. They were the inevitable outcome of a boy abandoned by stability, consumed by anger, and determined to defy a world that had given him nothing but pain. David Allan Coe's transformation from a hardened prisoner to a musician was not the kind of fairy tale Nashville likes to tell. It was gritty, dangerous, and full of contradictions. By the time he left prison in the 1960s, Coe had already spent much of his youth and early adulthood behind bars, serving time for car theft, robbery, and other crimes that reflected his disdain for authority and his need to survive by any means necessary. Prison was not just a punishment for him, it became the crucible that forged his identity. He endured violence, humiliation, and loneliness. But within those walls, he also discovered a voice, one that told stories no polished Nashville songwriter would dare to put into words. He began scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper, writing songs about survival, betrayal, and the pain of confinement. When he was finally released, he didn't head to a steady job or try to blend back into society. He headed straight to Nashville, carrying with him little more than his guitar, his songs, and his defiance. Nashville at the time was a city polished to perfection, a place where producers shaped every note and stars played the game for fame and approval. Coe, however, was the opposite of what the industry wanted. He looked like trouble. He acted like trouble. He was covered in tattoos long before tattoos were mainstream. He dressed flamboyantly in rhinestones and leather, and he spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the stories he sang. He didn't just sing about prison life. He had survived it. While others romanticized rebellion, Coe embodied it. His authenticity was impossible to ignore, even if it scared people. Industry insiders didn't quite know what to make of him. He was too rough, too raw, too unpredictable. Yet, there was a brilliance in his songs that couldn't be denied. He began performing in small clubs and biker bars, places where outsiders gathered, and slowly word spread about the ex-convict. With the unpolished voice and the fearless storytelling, he eventually caught the attention of record labels, but even then, his career was anything but easy. He was never fully accepted by the Nashville establishment. He was too controversial, too unwilling to compromise. But for Coe, that was never the point. He wasn't there to be accepted. He was there to tell the truth as he saw it. He declared himself an outlaw long before the term became a marketing slogan. And he wore his prison past not as shame, but as proof that he was real in a business full of fakes. David Allan Coe's rise from prisoner to musician was not a story of redemption. It was a story of reinvention, of a man who refused to be silenced, and whose voice carried the weight of a life lived outside the rules. When the outlaw country movement began to take shape in the 1970s, with artists like Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Johnny Paycheck challenging the clean-cut Nashville system, David Allan Coe found himself in the perfect place to rise. But unlike others, he didn't just step into the outlaw label for image. He lived it with every fiber of his being. He had the scars, the criminal record, the prison stories, and the rebellious heart to prove it. Coe quickly gained attention, not just as a performer, but as a songwriter of immense talent. While his own songs often shocked and unsettled the mainstream, his pen gave life to hits for others. He wrote, "Take This Job and Shove It," a song that Johnny Paycheck turned into a national anthem for the working class. He also crafted ballads and stories that displayed a softer side, like "Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone," recorded by Tanya Tucker, which revealed that beneath his rough exterior was a man capable of deeply moving poetry. These songs made him respected by some of the very people who distrusted his outlaw ways. His stage shows became legendary, flamboyant, unpredictable, and always dangerous. Coe would arrive dressed in rhinestone suits one night, leather biker gear the next, and sometimes in costumes that left crowds either cheering or shaking their heads. He thrived on pushing boundaries, blurring the lines between performer and provocateur. But it was this unpredictability that made him stand out. In a sea of polished performers, Coe was raw and fearless, a man who would say or sing things no one else dared. While the outlaw label helped other artists find mainstream success, Coe remained on the fringes. Radio stations hesitated to play his songs, and Nashville executives were often uncomfortable with his image. He was never given the same platforms as Willie or Waylon, and much of it was his own doing. He refused to play by the rules, refused to clean up his act for airplay, and often made enemies instead of allies. Yet, among fans of the outlaw movement, he became a cult hero. People connected with the honesty in his voice, the grit in his lyrics, and the lived experience behind every word. He wasn't pretending to be an outlaw. He was the real thing. This authenticity made him both admired and feared, a man who stood outside Nashville's approval and seemed to prefer it that way. But as his star rose in outlaw country, so too did the controversies, and Coe seemed determined to walk a path that would eventually lead him not to the heights of glory, but to the depths of isolation. For now, though, David Allan Coe had carved out his place in country music history as one of its most dangerous, brilliant, and unpredictable outlaws. As David Allan Coe's name became more recognized, so too did the controversies that surrounded him, controversies that would forever define his career as much as his music did. Unlike Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, who found ways to balance rebellion with mainstream acceptance, Coe leaned into the chaos. He seemed determined not only to break the rules, but to make sure everyone knew he was breaking them. His music, already raw and unapologetic, took darker turns that shocked critics and alienated potential fans. He recorded a series of underground X-rated albums filled with explicit lyrics, crude humor, and racially and sexually offensive themes that pushed him further from the Nashville establishment and stained his reputation in ways that would never fully fade. While some fans saw these projects as proof of his fearlessness, others saw them as proof that he was self-destructive, unable or unwilling to separate shock value from true artistry. Mainstream radio stations refused to touch those albums, and critics labeled him a pariah, a man too wild even for outlaw country. But the controversies didn't stop with his music. Coe's personal life often made headlines for the wrong reasons. Failed marriages, lawsuits, fights with promoters, and feuds with fellow musicians painted a picture of a man who thrived on conflict. He often seemed to sabotage his own chances at wider success, choosing to provoke rather than conform. He was both admired for his refusal to compromise and condemned for the bridges he burned along the way. Touring, which should have been his steady income and lifeline to fans, became another battleground. Many venues hesitated to book him, fearing his reputation or the rowdy crowds he attracted. And yet, he still found audiences in biker rallies, small clubs, and among the faithful who believed in his outlaw authenticity. But, as the years went on, those crowds became smaller, and the financial struggles grew heavier. His image as the ultimate rebel kept him alive in outlaw circles, but also kept him isolated from the kind of mainstream respect that his peers enjoyed. In interviews, he often lashed out at critics and the industry, blaming others for shutting him out. But underneath the bravado, there was a man deeply wounded by rejection. The same rebellion that made him unique also ensured that he would never find lasting acceptance. By the time the outlaw movement itself began to fade, Coe found himself standing alone, carrying a reputation so heavy that even allies kept their distance. What could have been a career of enduring legacy became one mired in controversy, leaving him with fewer opportunities and fewer friends. The isolation that followed was not sudden. It was built slowly, controversy by controversy, until David Allan Coe became a man admired only by a loyal few and shunned by the world that once promised him a stage. By the 1990s, the outlaw country movement had slowed, and the music industry had shifted to newer faces and cleaner sounds. For David Allan Coe, this meant fewer chances, fewer stages, and fewer people willing to take a gamble on him. The rebellious image that once drew crowds now felt outdated to some, and his reputation for controversy made it even harder to secure opportunities. While Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings were celebrated as legends, invited to festivals and award shows, Coe was left on the outside, forced to rely on small clubs, biker rallies, and low-paying gigs to keep himself afloat. The man who had once written hits that topped charts was now struggling to keep the lights on. His voice, which had once carried both grit and emotion, began to fade under the weight of age. Years of smoking, drinking, and the relentless grind of life on the road. Fans noticed the difference. The fire was still there, but the power wasn't, and it hurt Coe deeply to know that his body was betraying him. His health began to decline further as decades of hard living caught up with him. Chronic pain plagued him, the result of countless accidents, fights, and reckless choices. In 2008, he suffered a near-fatal car crash in Florida that left him badly injured, adding to his health struggles and putting a dent in his already fragile career. Medical bills piled up, and with little financial stability, Coe was forced to keep touring when his body desperately needed rest. The outlaw who once defied the world was now trapped in a cycle of survival, needing the money from live shows but barely strong enough to perform them. Friends and fans noticed the change. His performances became less reliable, his stamina weaker, and his once daring stage presence dulled by pain and exhaustion. On top of his physical decline came financial troubles. Years of poor management, legal battles, and his own reckless spending had left him in debt. Unlike some of his peers, he didn't have massive record royalties or corporate sponsorships to fall back on. He lived gig to gig, often leaning on loyal fans and biker communities to support him. Benefit concerts were organized to help with his medical costs, a humiliating reality for a man who once stood as a symbol of independence and self-reliance. Yet through it all, Coe refused to give up the image of the outlaw. He still appeared on stage wearing rhinestones, leather, and tattoos, clinging to the persona that had defined him for decades. But the truth was clear. Time had caught up with him. The years of rebellion had left scars on his body, his career, and his spirit. David Allan Coe was no longer the wild outlaw on the rise. He was a fading figure, worn down by the very life that had once made him unforgettable. If David Allan Coe's career decline was difficult, his personal life was even more devastating. For a man who spent his entire life fighting against the world, the battles at home cut the deepest. His marriages often ended in heartbreak, torn apart by infidelity, addiction, and the restless spirit that refused to let him settle down. Coe was a father, but his relationships with his children were strained by years on the road, financial instability, and the chaos of his lifestyle. The image of the outlaw may have made him larger than life on stage, but behind closed doors, it left scars on the people closest to him. The tragedies didn't stop with broken families. Coe endured devastating losses and accidents that compounded his suffering. In 2008, the near-fatal car accident in Florida left him severely injured, forcing him to cancel shows and leaving him with medical bills he could not afford. This was only one of several moments when his body betrayed him, and each time it was harder for him to recover. Pain became his constant companion, leaving him bitter and more isolated than ever before. He also lost close friends and peers in the outlaw movement, men like Waylon Jennings and Johnny Paycheck, who had once stood beside him on the wild road of rebellion. Their deaths were reminders of mortality, and though Coe rarely spoke of vulnerability, those who knew him saw the grief weigh heavy on him. Every passing year stripped away another piece of the outlaw brotherhood, until Coe stood nearly alone, an aging rebel surrounded more by memories than companions. Financial loss was another tragedy that defined his later years. The royalties from his biggest songs often slipped through his fingers, leaving him with little security. Lawsuits, divorces, and poor financial management drained what little wealth he accumulated. He was forced to rely on touring long after his body was able to handle it, and when he couldn't, he leaned on benefit shows organized by others who wanted to help him survive. For a man who built his reputation on defiance and independence, the humiliation of needing charity cut deep. Yet pride wouldn't allow him to admit it publicly. He carried the pain quietly, hiding it behind leather, rhinestones, and a hardened expression. In his heart, however, the losses piled up. Loss of health, loss of stability, loss of family, and loss of the future he once believed music might give him. By the time the 2010s arrived, David Allan Coe was no longer just an outlaw by image. He was a man living on the edge of survival, enduring tragedies that even the toughest spirit could not fully withstand. What had begun as a fiery life of rebellion had become a slow march through grief, pain, and regret. In his final years, David Allan Coe lived in the shadows of the legend he had once been, a man remembered more for the chaos of his past than the songs that had once defined him. The outlaw life that had fueled his rise eventually left him broken down, worn out, and financially unstable. No longer headlining big venues, he played wherever he could. Small town bars, biker rallies, and occasional music festivals that still welcomed him for the aura of rebellion he carried. But these performances were no longer about fame or artistry. They were survival, the only way he could keep himself afloat, as medical bills and debts piled higher with each passing year. His health deteriorated further, and the fiery energy that once electrified audiences dwindled into something fragile. He often performed sitting down, his voice weakened, his body stiff with pain. The rhinestone suits and leather jackets were still there, but they looked less like symbols of pride and more like armor, hiding a man weighed down by exhaustion. Fans who came to see him in those final years noticed the difference. The outlaw was still defiant, still carrying the spark of rebellion, but it was dimmed by time and suffering. Behind the scenes, life was equally grim. He faced ongoing medical struggles, the lingering effects of his car crash, and years of hard living, and he relied on his wife and a small circle of loyal supporters to keep going. Benefit concerts were organized to raise money for his medical expenses, and while they helped, the reality was undeniable. David Allan Coe, the outlaw who once seemed untouchable, was now fragile and dependent. The music industry, which had never fully embraced him, moved on without a glance, celebrating others while Coe faded into obscurity. The loneliness that came with this was perhaps the cruelest part. For decades, Coe had insisted he didn't need the industry's approval, but in his final years, the lack of recognition stung. He had given country music unforgettable songs, influenced generations of outsiders, and lived a life truer to the outlaw image than any of his peers. Yet he was rarely mentioned in the same breath as the legends he once stood beside. He became a ghost of the movement he had helped to build. To those who still followed him, his later years were difficult to watch. A man once larger than life, reduced to struggling just to get by. Every performance carried a sense of farewell, a reminder that the outlaw era was nearly gone. For David Allan Coe, the sad truth of his final years was that he had lived too hard, too fast, and for too long without ever finding the peace he deserved. What remained was a man who had once challenged the world and won small battles, but who ultimately lost the war against time, health, and the consequences of his choices. David Allan Coe's ending was not marked by the glory and recognition that many of his peers enjoyed. Instead, it was quiet, overshadowed by years of controversy, financial struggles, and declining health. The man who once demanded the world's attention through his shocking songs and flamboyant image slipped into a kind of cultural obscurity, remembered only by the most devoted of fans and by the outlaw circles that still saw him as a hero. While Willie Nelson was celebrated as a living legend, and Johnny Cash's legacy was preserved in books, movies, and tributes, Coe became the forgotten outlaw, a man whose brilliance was buried under the weight of his own self-destruction. Yet to understand David Allan Coe's legacy, one must look beyond the controversies and into the core of his music. He gave country music some of its most enduring songs, from the working-class anthem, "Take This Job and Shove It," to the hauntingly beautiful, "Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone." These songs, stripped of the noise surrounding his personal life, reveal the depth of his talent, his ability to capture emotion with honesty, and his rare gift for storytelling. Even in his most controversial works, there was an unflinching rawness that reflected a man who never shied away from truth, no matter how ugly or uncomfortable it might be. That honesty, however, came at a cost. His refusal to compromise meant he was never fully embraced by Nashville. Radio stations banned his songs, labels grew wary of his antics, and critics often dismissed him as a vulgar shock artist rather than the complex songwriter he truly was. In the end, this left him in a lonely position, respected by a cult following, ignored by the mainstream, and carrying the bitter knowledge that he had been left behind by an industry he helped shape. His ending was sad, not only because of his failing health or his financial struggles, but because of the sense of wasted potential. Many believe that had Coe been willing to temper his rebellious streak, he might have stood alongside Cash, Nelson, and Jennings as one of the most celebrated icons of the outlaw movement. Instead, his choices locked him into a legacy of controversy and struggle. For the man himself, though, Compromise was never an option. He lived as he sang, without apology, without regret, and without bending to anyone else's expectations. That was both his greatest strength and his greatest downfall. To the fans who stayed with him until the end, Coe remained a symbol of defiance, a man who refused to sell out even when it cost him everything. His sad life and ending became a cautionary tale for those who followed in his footsteps. The outlaw life, as glamorous as it seemed in the songs, was unforgiving. It rewarded authenticity, but it punished excess, and few lived that lesson more completely than David Allan Coe. Even in death, his name stirs debate. Was he a genius songwriter undone by his own recklessness? Was he a provocateur who cared more about shock than art? Or was he simply a man who lived too hard for too long in a world that was never built for people like him? The truth, like Coe himself, is complicated. What cannot be denied is the influence he left behind. Countless artists who came after him, those who sang about rebellion, about pain, about life outside the polished image of Nashville, owe something to Coe's willingness to be unapologetically real. He showed that country music could be more than heartbreak ballads and love songs. It could be dangerous, raw, and reflective of life's darkest corners. His ending may have been sad, but his contribution remains undeniable. In the story of outlaw country, David Allan Coe is the chapter many try to skip, but it is also the chapter that reveals the cost of living the outlaw dream without compromise. His life serves as both an inspiration and a warning. Inspiration to those who see in him the courage to be true to oneself, and a warning to those who believe rebellion comes without consequence. The sad life and ending of David Allan Coe may never be celebrated on the same grand stage as others, but in the quiet corners where truth matters more than fame. His songs still live, his story still resonates, and his legacy still lingers like the final note of a song too raw to ever fade completely.